Good Thursday morning to all. This is Yechezkel mostly chapter 5, but I wanted to say a few last things about chapter 4. We are been experiencing, um, hold on one moment, get one over. We have been journeying with Yechezkel through some prophetic theater, and the bulk of chapter 4 was the instructions to him to inscribe an image of Jerusalem on a brick, uh, then set up around it little miniature figures that would be enacting a siege, and then place some type of metal object, iron object, in between him and that scene that he has set up, and then lie on his side 390 days on one side and 40 days on the other side, somehow constrained by God, and during that time to eat very little. This Ezekiel, what we call Ezekiel 4:9 bread, which originally we think is going to be baked on fuel from human excrement, but Ezekiel protests and God agrees to allow him to use only animal excrement as the fuel for the fire for baking this bread, and he has very limited rations of that food. The fact that he basically eats bread and drinks water, I just wanted to note in terms of, on the one hand, it sounds like a great suffering. On the other hand, it's also worth noting that in Pirkei Avot, this is the season in which we customarily study a chapter of Pirkei Avot every Shabbat afternoon between Pesach and Shavuot, and chapter 6, which seems to be a later addition to Pirkei Avot, when it says Kachi darka shel Torah, this is the way of a life of Torah. It says Pat bemelach tochal umayim bimesura tishteh v'al haaretz tishan v'chayei tsa'ar tichyeh uvatorah ata amel. Eat bread with salt, drink mayim bimisura, rationed water. And we saw in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 11, mayim bimisura tishteh, you're going to drink rationed water. Sleep on the ground. This is Ezekiel lying on his side on the ground. And have a life of tsar, however we want to translate that. The JPS or the whatever the translation here of Pirkei Avot says, it means a life of privation and labor in Torah. So on the one hand, there's no doubt when we read this chapter of Ezekiel that he's meant to be suffering. On the other hand, the kind of Spartan, this was from Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 11, page 1161 that we were looking at. The sort of Spartan lifestyle is in some settings lauded by the sages as something which enables you as a life, which is somehow a recipe for a life of Torah, whether that just means no distractions, modesty, not focusing on material needs. There is a kind of a other flip side of the coin here, in which there's something praiseworthy about this experience. But it's no doubt in Ezekiel itself, it's presented as meant to be very harsh. And the other text that interacts a little bit with our Ezekiel's diet is in Vayikra Rabbah, one of the Midrashim, actually quite appropriate to our season also, in the discussion of the Omer offering, the barley offering that was brought on the second day of Passover, the day after the first day of Passover, and from which we count 49 days till we get to Shavuot, which is the celebration of the wheat harvest. So that barley offering, the rabbis talk about and seems to be clear, was a lesser grain than wheat. Was often considered to be animal feed instead of human feed. But the rabbis in a midrash say over and over, don't degrade the Omer offering. Don't be down on the fact that it's a barley offering, because it's in the merit of this barley offering that a lot of important things happened. And one of the things the rabbis say in this midrash, they say, I'm scrolling down here, you don't have it in front of you in person, but those on Zoom have it in front of them on the screen. They say, don't be down on the Omer offering because he sha'amda lahem biyamei Yechezkel. That was what stood them in good stead in the days of Yechezkel. As it says in Yechezkel chapter 4, verse 9, Vata kach lecha chitin usorin. Take for yourself a wheat and barley bread or grain and make this bread. And somehow the fact that this was what was instructed to Yechezkel and sustained him means there's some merit to barley. While the rabbis are mentioning it, they say, Rabbi Chama bar Chalafta said it was mostly barley. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, Liba bahen dvarim shehen meritzin livnei me'ayim. This recipe for the bread that Ezekiel was made, which had all these other ingredients, the millet and the emmer and the lentils, etc., these things were chosen because they hurry up the bowels. This is a good, laxative bread. It speeds digestion and clears out your insides. And then, but this is what I wanted to bring to you. Ushmuel Amar, Shmuel said, a early Babylonian Amora from the beginning of the period of the Talmud, said about this Ezekiel bread, Taman Amrin, there they say, might refer to in Eretz Yisrael, I'm not sure, there they say, Avadin mine lechalba, we made this recipe and we fed it to a dog, velo tama, and the dog refused to taste it. So on the one hand, don't be down on barley because it's so great and it has these, healthy properties. On the other hand, when they actually cooked up Ezekiel 4:9 bread and put it in front of a dog, the dog was like, no, thank you. So, again, we have what's interesting here in these two texts is we sort of see on the one hand, some kind of praise of the setting, the rations, the sort of life that's being presented to Ezekiel. On the other hand, when you get right down to it, nobody would want to experience something like this. Now, that was the almost the very end of chapter 4. The very end of chapter 4, after this whole setup was presented, was what Ezekiel reports God says to him in verse 16. O mortal, I'm going to break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight in anxiety, and drink water by measure in horror, so that lacking bread and water they will stare at each other, heartsick over their iniquity. So the what Ezekiel is experiencing is supposed to be a foreshadowing of what's going to befall the Judeans upon the siege of Jerusalem. They're going to have very little to eat. In a context of great fear and concern, and they're going to have nothing to do but look at each other and say, woe is us, look at what we have done wrong. So that's where chapter 4 stops. Each of the chapters that we've seen so far in Ezekiel really leads into the other. We've had no natural breaking point or new prophecy. Chapter 1, vision of God. Chapter 2, God's first message. From there we go into the kind of first prophecy to Ezekiel. Now the setup to Ezekiel of this prophetic theater, and now that chapter 4 flows right into chapter 5, in which Ezekiel gets a couple of more theatrical, performative acts that he's supposed to undertake as a prophet, and that's what we're going to see here. So we're going to give some of our in-person folks a chance to read. Stell, maybe we'll start with you, chapter 5, verse 1.
Heartsick over their iniquity. Is that?
Right after that. Right after that.
Yeah.
Just continue right after that.
Right.
And you, O mortal.
Oh, and you, O mortal, take a sharp knife, use it as a barber razor, and pass it over your head and beard. Then take scales and divide the hair. When the days of siege are completed, destroy a third part in fire in the city. Take a third and strike it with sword all around. all around the city. And I have trouble seeing in the slide.
No
I'm
problem.
sorry.
No problem. We'll pass it to Ellen. Go ahead.
And scatter a third of the wind and unsheath a sword after them. Take a few hairs from there and tie them up in your skirts, and take some more of them and cast them into the fire and burn them in the fire. From this as a first shall you go out upon the whole house of Israel. Thus said the Lord God, I set this Jerusalem in the midst of nations with countries round about her, but she rebelled against my rules and my laws, acting more wickedly than the nations and the countries around her. She rejected my rule and disobeyed my laws. Assuredly, thus said the Lord God, because you have outdone the nations that are round about you, you have not obeyed my laws or followed my rules, nor have you observed the rules of nations round about you. Assuredly, thus said the Lord God, I in turn am going to deal with you, and I will execute judgment in your midst in the sight of the nations.
Okay, good pausing point. Mamatova, do you want to continue on verse 9? You have it there? Yep.
On account of all your abominations, I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I will never do again. Assuredly, parents shall eat their children in your midst, and children shall eat their parents. I will execute judgments against you, and I will scatter all your survivors in every direction. Assuredly, as I live, says the Lord God, because you defied my sanctuary with all your detestable things and all your abominations, I in turn will shear you away and show no pity. I in turn will show no compassion. 1/3 of you shall die of pestilence and perish in your midst by famine. 1/3 shall fall by the sword around you, and I will scatter 1/3 in every direction, and will unsheathe the sword after them. I will vent all my anger and satisfy my fury upon them. And when I vent all my fury upon them, they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my passion. I will make you a ruin and a mockery among the nations round about you, in the sight of every passerby. And when I execute judgment upon you in anger and rage and furious chastisement, you shall be a mockery and a derision, a warning and a horror to the nations around about you. I, the Lord, have spoken. When I loose the deadly arrows of famine against those doomed to destruction, when I loose them against you to destroy you, I will heap more famine upon you and break your staff of bread. I will let loose against you famine and wild beast, and they shall bereave you. Pestilence and bloodshed shall sweep through you, and I will bring the sword upon you by the Lord.
Okay, that's just terrible. And here we sort of see Ezekiel in many ways the harshest of the prophets in terms of his description of the destruction which is coming. It's pretty devastating. Well, that'll be the second half. I mean, it's the bulk of the chapter, but that'll be the second half. But I want to still take a little bit of time coming back to the first half of the chapter. So the kind of final series of theatrical actions has to do with his hair. So we read in verse 1, Kach lecha cherev chada, take a sharp knife. In the Hebrew, a cherev really even is a sword. So it may also mean knife, but when we hear more than that, but something, really large and destructive. And then he says, Ta'al hagalabim tikachen alach. Use it as a barber's razor. In other words, there's a mismatch here. There are barber's razors. That's what you would normally cut your hair with, but you're going to take a sword and cut your hair with it as though it's like a barber's razor. And you pass it over your head, and over your beard. V'lakachta lecha moznei mishkal v'chilaktam. And now you have to actually use scales to weigh out the hair and divide it into three parts. There's a sort of certain, precision that's being demanded here, an exacting approach in order to divide your head and beard hair into three piles. And then we're told that this is going to be done kimlot yemei hamatzor, when the days of the siege are completed. It's not clear to me whether that means the days of your 430 days of lying on your side where you're, mimicking and enacting the siege, or whether this is actually supposed to be done and then put on the side until actually some number of years later, probably, you get word that the siege on Jerusalem is actually completed. That's not clear in the verse, whether it's the actual siege that's going to come in the future or whether it's your, enactment of the siege. You take your three portions of hair. One part is burned up in fire. One part is struck with a sword all around the city, as he actually meant to walk out of his house and take a sword and hit his hair with the sword in different locations, kind of a wild thing to imagine. And then 1/3 is scattered to the wind, and a sword is unsheathed after it. So instead of kind of like taking a bundle of hair and whacking it with a sword, you throw it up into the air and let it spread, and then you just sort of unsheath your sword. That's the three portions. And then we're also told, or Ezekiel was also told in verse 3, "V'lakachta misham ma'at b'mispar," take a few hairs from there. We don't know if that's from the, meant to be set aside originally, or what it more sounds like is from the scattered to the wind hairs, pick up a few, v'tzarta otam bichnafecha, and tie them up in your skirts. So we have, and then we're not quite done. Take some more. Now that we don't know exactly, again, where is this last pile of? Take some more and burn them in fire. Right, we have 4/3 here. It sort of sounds like maybe somebody was lacking in math, and this is going to be symbolic of, or almost the source of, a fire which will go out upon the whole house of Israel. So there's kind of a movement back and forth between almost like imagination or theater and reality. The idea that this metaphor, this physical experience, which is meant to be symbolic, somehow actually morphs into the real experience in the end of verse 4 when we're told, Mimenu teitzei eshal kol beit Yisrael, from this fire, the fire will go forth against the whole house of Israel. It's sort of like, again, this like merging between the theatric, symbolic, metaphorical, and the real. So it's a little bit of a dreamy, and not in a good way, but a kind of a dream-like, or slippage between imagination or enacting and the real punishment. So, but yeah, we're gonna take comments in a moment. Just the question I want to pose, and we'll try to think about in addition to anything else we want to share, as sort of what other associations with shaving head and hair do we have in the Bible? And was the shaving merely a kind of preparation so that you'd have the raw materials to work with, right? We want to do something with your hair, so shave your hair so that we can do something with your hair. Or was the shaving experience also part and parcel of the prophetic message? And if so, what are the possible associations that may come from that? So I want to explore that a little bit, and we're going to start with Estelle, who may have had a different comment or question. Yep.
Question. Is this something that Ezekiel imagines God to tell him? Is it sort of just as
Ezekiel crazy.
not for real, just his imagination, or is this really what God is telling him to do?
Yeah. How can we know for sure? How can we know for sure? It seems either interpretation certainly is a possible one. Okay, good. So Mama Toby says he must have had a lot of hair. Yes, one of the many essayists on 929 compares him to Elijah. Elijah the prophet we know was a hairy guy. His hair was like a mantle upon him, and it does seem like Ezekiel would have had to have had a lot of hair. There are various prescriptions around priests and when they can and cannot cut their hair. Ezekiel was a priest, so but hard to say for sure. There. But yes, it's a really interesting question around sort of how much hair he had. We're gonna make sure we get to everybody. Yep, Ruby.
Hair is soft and we lose it. It's just hard to imagine hair having that potential strength and weaponry.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
something that I could never have imagined.
Yes. Yeah. So, and when you say, what's the thing that you were imagining? Meaning, what's the issue with the hair, or what's not working in the interpretation with the hair? What were you just now?
I just don't see it as a weapon. I just don't see it to be used that way or to imagine it that way.
Right.
To begin with.
Right. But so remember, I guess this is a question we want to make sure we understand. Is the hair being used as a weapon, or is the hair the symbol of the victim of the weapon, right? Remember the idea is that we're shaving off hair, and then the hair is going to be brought out to various places and attacked. So the hair seems almost symbolic of the weak Israelites who are going to be hit by the sword and attacked by famine and burned in the fire. So I wouldn't expect it to be, need to be sort of sturdy or anything like that. Yes.
Isn't the Samson concept that the hair was his strength?
Okay, good.
When he lost his hair, he couldn't do anything.
Okay, good. So one association to put in the hopper here is the story of Samson, where his hair seems to be his strength. So one idea is that hair represents, even if it's not necessarily the weapon, it may still be symbolic of the victim, but it represents strength. And so when it represents strength, let's say when it's attached to its roots, and when it is cut off, we almost imagine both the hair is weak and the previously hairy, now shorn person is weak. So there is so some of this. So now we're already getting to almost a suggestion, if we could, that maybe this is sorry, I don't have words today. Maybe this is too elaborate, but somehow there's an association, almost without assigning the roles concretely, that when the Israelites are in constructive relationship with God, we're like the hair on God's body or something like that. We are bonded and connected. And when we are not relating appropriately to God, we become separated from God, like hair which is shorn. Now, we haven't here imagined that means that God becomes weak, maybe that then we become punished. But one dimension of this might be to think about the healthy state is hair connected to its roots. And that's the Israelites bonded to God. I never thought about this before we started to discuss it this morning. It's a wonderful suggestion. And the cutting off of the hair represents the disconnection or detachment that the Israelites have made from their God, and that then makes them vulnerable to attack. Were you going to say something more?
This is a continuation. Before this, when he's lying on his side, but he's being punished for Israel and for their sins. So this is just a further punishment, a different form of it, but it's supposed to happen after he gets up, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
And so now he's being punished again, and he's being punished for Israel's sin. And maybe scattering that hair is a reminder to all of them about how much they're being punished.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And by the way, just to the question of how much hair he had, presumably he had at least 430 days worth of hair because he was not allowed to go do anything during that period of time. So if he hadn't gotten a haircut recently when he got that prophecy, and now he had 430 days without a haircut, okay, it's there's some decent amount of hair there. Yeah, Graham, and then we'll take more comments.
Hi. Yeah, well, the conversation was going on. I did a quick rhyme. Could I read it?
Sure.
Let's see. Okay. Ezekiel got a haircut. His head felt so light. His payot now flowed in the winds and took flight. He felt so light-headed, his spirit was free. Where once he was blind, now he could see.
Mm.
Free of his fears and his selfish concerns, free of the qualities God always spurns, a brand new look and a brand new feel. Where once there was doubt, is now only zeal. The sword is a weapon, the sword is a friend. The sword will destroy you if you sin again.
Hmm. Well, it's as always beautiful and thought provoking. I guess what's
It's
interesting
fun.
in particular in what you wrote was the sense that the Ezekiel is in some way freed by the haircutting. Um, it certainly is the case that the haircutting chronologically follows his freedom from these 430 days of of confinement. Um, but to me, as we read the chapter, the haircutting uh, is part of the suffering. Like I don't know how he experienced the hair growing. That is, by the way, of course, a sign of mourning when we talk about symbolisms of hair cutting. Not cutting your hair is one of the practices in a time period of mourning, apropos of my beard during this season, Sfirata Omer, and the 3 weeks in the summertime where we mourn the destruction of the temple and we don't get haircuts or shave, and mourners for immediate loved ones also don't get haircuts or shave. So growing hair is actually a sign of mourning, and the haircut as a sign of kind of returning to hygiene and care and focus on appearance is often a symbol of restoration, etc. But this one, it seems to it may encompass all opposite symbolisms, both the hair cutting, which frees the person who has been growing their hair, but again, there's so much punishment coming alongside it. I'm conflicted whether I read Ezekiel as kind of freed and liberated in this moment or not. But I think that aspect of the poem opens up for us, another vista of thinking about the haircut as marking the end of a period of suffering. So I think that's also really interesting. Hold on, those who are in person, hold on. We're going to get to a few more folks on Zoom. Lance, and then what's that? Okay, yes. Okay, so we're sorry. We're going to apologies for adjusting the order. Mama Toby's going to say something related to Graham's poem, and then we'll go more.
That he mentioned the payas.
Mm-hmm.
It says to shave his head and his beard. It doesn't actually mention payas.
Mm-hmm.
How symbolic would it be to think of him with a shaved head and a shaved beard, but still having the
His side curls.
obligation to
Yes.
God in
Right.
the
Right. That's very interesting. I wonder whether any of the commentaries comment on that question, right? Because we do the Torah when it talks about head hair, it sometimes does differentiate between rosh and peah, between kind of the hair on your head and the hair on the ends or the corners. So I wonder if anyone comments on whether he actually shaved his head and his beard but left his payas. Fascinating. Let me just make a note. I will be curious to see if there's anything on that. Yes. Great. Okay, we're going to do Lance, Mom, and Dad, and then more of our in-person raised hands. Go ahead, Lance.
Okay, I see Ezekiel here as the suffering servant of Isaiah, a messianic figure who will suffer for the sins of others, particularly, of course, in Isaiah 53. This passage describes a figure who is despised, rejected, and suffers horribly for the sake of others. While some interpretations suggest the servant is a nation of Israel, others, particularly within Christianity, identify the servant with Jesus Christ. Now, we know that Ezekiel was both a prophet and a Cohen. We also, like I would suggest very strongly, that Jesus was both a prophet and a Cohen. And I look at this whole thing from a different lens than I'm sure most people do. I see this as an attempt to punish the Israelites, but not the Jewish Israelites, the Samaritan Israelites. And I think I'm not even sure that this is rabbinic. I have no idea who really wrote this. It could have been Assyrians, it could have been Greeks, Persians, and a whole long list of anti-Semites. But for me, this is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And as a half joke, I would give this passage, I would rewrite it with ChatGPT and give this passage to Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. And they would be jumping up and down, yelling and screaming, "This is marvelous."
Thank you. Thank you. Mom and Dad.
Okay, can you put up verse 3?
Yep, hold on. Yep, there it is.
Okay. So I was very intrigued by that. After all, Ezekiel is told to scatter his hair, implying that the people, the Israelites, are going to be burned and killed by wild animals or whatever. Then he tells them to take a few hairs
Mm-hmm.
and tie them up in your skirts.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's the saving remnant. Not everyone is going to be killed
Yes.
or die in this whatever is happening.
Yes.
That Ezekiel is going to protect in some way some of the people. And I can almost imagine that even though the text says take a few hairs, that he would take a handful
Mm-hmm.
and save as many people as he could.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, a beautiful, beautiful reading. What's striking to me in that reading, and there are other commentaries that I saw that definitely suggested that, is that, we don't see that application in the end of the chapter, meaning when God, interprets what God is asking Ezekiel to do here and says, and so certainly, starting with verse 12, I share that again. A third of you will die in the pestilence or perish by famine, a third by the sword, and a third of you will be scattered, and I'm going to destroy you, and destroy you, and destroy you. There is no mention at the end of the chapter of, and a few of you will be brought back or saved or protected, etc., etc. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't think that it disqualifies that interpretation. In fact, I quite think that that is the most likely interpretation. But it's jarring that God is embedding the in the theater the indication of some will be saved, but never actually says when God describes what this actually is going to mean or look like. God never says, and a few of you will be, I will restore. God says that in plenty of other prophecies, and in Ezekiel too, it certainly appears, but it feels like a glaring omission here, given that I think that that's the most likely interpretation of the storing a few up in your, in your skirt. By the way, the language there, take take some from there, small in number. Tie them up in your skirts. But kanaf is also the corner of a garment, which is where the tzitzit are placed. So there's even just like a tiny association, almost like hairs coming off of the corner of your garment. It's just like a little trippy sort of, counterpart to tzitzit, just visually as we think about the different possible meanings of this. Okay, I see Graham has Graham. Is that still a hand for a new comment? or I didn't lower it from before.
Wait a minute. Yeah, this just reminded me of the cedars of Lebanon.
Hmm.
Where uh, that it's a symbol of strength
Mm-hmm.
and um, resilience. Resilience being recovery after a defeat, right, or a punishment, and that sort of a symbol of survival in the seed, you know, that is left after like a fire.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So anyway, it just occurred to me. I thought it would be interesting to draw a parallel. What was it, King Solomon? And it was when he built the temple, right? Wait a minute.
Did use cedars of Lebanon.
Yeah. And yeah, anyway, that just came to mind.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, hold on. Let's get our speakers list going. We'll go Mama Toby and Ruby. Okay, we'll get everybody in person, and then we're gonna go to Arnie. Yeah, go ahead, Mama Toby.
I just say that he does give reasons for, like, the fire will remind him, to what they did. He doesn't give any reason for putting the hairs in the clothes in the dress and saving. It's interesting.
Right. That's sort of like it's there's some I don't know scholarship around kind of parable, and does every part of the parable need to have a correspondence? Maybe it's dream interpretation. Is every part of a dream significant, or are some details just coincidental? Here, it's hard to imagine that the hairs in the skirt is coincidental, but we don't get the spelling out of what it's about. Yeah, Ruby.
Well, going back to the concept of hair, if you have a fight with an enemy, the hair makes you very vulnerable because it's so easy to grasp.
Mm-hmm.
So hair is also something that that is not always a benefit to you.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about it as a sword, but also it's something that also can be dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
to make you vulnerable.
A vulnerability. So is there any way, again, even though it seems counter to the second half in which the hair is, being the symbol of the victimization, but I guess you're saying hair on your head also hair on you can make you vulnerable because it can be something enemies can grab onto. So the shaved off, it's preserving that idea of something that makes you vulnerable. If we're choosing a symbol of something to attack in a person, maybe we're choosing hair, but for the utility of the prophecy, it has to be shaved off so it can be divided into parts, but it's still the symbol of a thing that can be grabbed, a kind of entryway into harm or vulnerability. Yeah, nice.
They grow their hair long and they scalp.
Right. Native Americans growing their hair long and scalping. Yeah. Estelle?
Sort of two things. If anybody remembers, years ago, there was a man, and he was Jewish, by the way. He called himself the Mighty Adam. And his one claim to fame was that his hair was so strong. And I've seen him do this. He tied his hair, parts of his hair, to a fire engine. And with his hair, he pulled the fire engine, just showing the strength of the hair.
Wow.
Yeah. It was everything that he did. It was on Coney Island, and he sort of sold soap, but his main attraction was the Mighty Adam and his hair. So as a sort of a comparison. But the other thing, I can't get over what Lance had said last week about Ezekiel and comparing it to Jesus to take the sins of everything on him. And frankly, instead of a negative, I think that's a very positive way of reacting and saving the Jewish people. You take what you can onto yourself, and you suffer for everybody. I think it's a great idea. I wish one person would do that. And
who do you nominate, Estelle? Who do you nominate?
well, I'm kind of selfish, and I wouldn't do myself or
Right.
my family.
But you would be, but if someone else volunteers, you would have no problem with that.
No problem with it. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. I am not a I am not a theologian, and so I just can't speak intelligently about this. But I don't think that the notion of individual an individual taking on suffering for the collective is foreign to Jewish belief, meaning we do see it in various forms. This Ezekiel chapter is one example. There's a fascinating midrash on the splitting of the sea, and I can't give all the details. I don't remember it sharply
One
enough,
person
but
drowned, that's it.
in which the rabbis somehow explain that the reason the Jews were saved at the sea was basically because like the punishments that they were deserving of all got shifted onto Job. Now, this is like a fascinating way of doing two things at once. If you believe that the Israelites weren't worthy of redemption, then how could they have been saved? And also, Job. Job is a big problem. What did Job ever do to, deserve all the punishment that he got? Okay, you have this, I know Lance, go ahead with, Satan and who was that and what was that all about and Plimo and all of those things. But for the rabbis, they're really bothered by the Job story. So this is like, two birds, one stone kind of situation. But it does, it does demonstrate that there was some theological openness to the idea that people might have taken on the suffering or the punishment or whatever it is of others. How that works and how it evolves and where we do and don't find it in Jewish theology, it's a big question, which I'm just not well enough informed to comment on. But enough to a little knowledge is not a good thing. It's a dangerous thing, but enough to say I think we do see this notion scattered about a little bit. Yes, right. Certainly we do feel that our soldiers are putting their lives on the line for our well-being. It's a related but different notion because it's not being imposed. It's sort of there is a national burden,
Well, that's
and not
self-defense.
everyone equally shares in it, but people who do it know they're doing it on behalf of others. They're overlapping concepts. Absolutely. Ellen, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Two things.
Okay,
One
please.
is
Then we're going to
that-
come to the Zoom comments. Yep.
That while he's lying there for the 400 and whatever days, nobody sees him.
Right.
So they don't really know he's suffering. And they don't know that it's for them or because of them or a warning to them. But once he gets up and he shaves his head and goes about his business, and especially if he has to go scattering it throughout the city, they're going to see him.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to know he's now become a visual
Mm-hmm.
and visible symbol
Mhm.
of suffering for them
Mm-hmm.
or their
That's great.
suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But I had another question that has I know there's an Orthodox Jewish custom about Jewish boys and not giving them a haircut
Mm-hmm.
for, I don't remember, a year or 2, 3 years. Is that any way related to this?
Great question. So let me try to comment on both. First of all, I really appreciate what you're pointing out, and maybe this certainly points to the break between chapter 4 and 5, even though it's a series of things. Right, the big shift here is that Ezekiel now goes out of the house, and in fact, the fact of this second part will not only finally have him be seen, but I imagine will likely lead to conversation. Oh, where have you been the last 430 days? Oh, your hair. Oh, what is all this hair thing about? Maybe Ezekiel then has the opportunity to say, oh, well, I was bound up by God in my house for the last such and such days. I had this whole setup and arrangement. Oh, well, why was that? Oh, well, because this is going to happen to the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem, etc. So the part 2 of the prophetic theater gives the opportunity for part 1 to actually become known. I think that's a really good and important point. And it evokes in a different way, just talking about the haircutting, etc. Like and this is not rigorously mandatory thing. But the walk around the block after the week of mourning also, suddenly you got to go out of the house at some point, of course, but there's a sort of that moment where people may see you and then it sort of triggers their realization, oh, this has been going on, or oh, I didn't see them. So I think that's very much there. When the second point was, I lost it for a moment. Yes, the children's haircut. Yes, it was called the upsherin in Yiddish, and in I don't know if it's even Hebrew or Aramaic, but you see it referred to in halachic or custom literature as chalaka. Yeah, it has a few. It has its origins are not 100% clear. There's an association with the idea that we do not harvest from fruit-bearing trees for 3 years, and only then we do. And so, because there are associations of, in the Torah, there's an association, even though it's not meant to be taken quite literally this way, of is a person a tree of the field? But we often read that actually as a declaration of fact. People bear some similarity to trees, and based on that, there's sort of the idea of we don't take, like we're hands off for these beginning stage of development. You don't want to mess with anything. Let it, go on its own, and we only kind of impose ourselves upon the child, at age 3. It also is associated with the kind of start of education. So oftentimes, when boys get that haircut, they'll put on a kippah or tzitzit for the first time, or they'll have an experience of learning the Hebrew alphabet, etc. And so there's sort of this idea of kind of not interfering and then beginning kind of the formal education. So that's one set of associations. I've also heard it sort of referred to as almost like the gender differentiation moment. In other words, like we don't treat boys or girls differently. At some point in Jewish law and practice, we've come to start to treat boys and girls differently. But like for this stage, we don't even get involved in, boys or girls, just everybody's, their own thing. So there are various associations with that. I'm sure there are more that I don't even know or didn't mention here. But there are fascinating customs around this. So, could this fit into that in one direction or the other in some way, kind of the letting the hair grow, and then what happens with it? By the way, there are customs that people take a lock of the hair. I don't know what they're meant to do with it, but the idea of divvying up the hair like Ezekiel does is sort of present there also. So it's not surprising that there are lots of hair rituals in, it's one of the unique parts of our bodies that we can do different things with and differentiate ourselves with, and that can be removed without danger. So like the idea that there's a lot in culture and religion that surrounds hair is not surprising. But so that's another fascinating possible association. Arnie, go ahead.
So I thought, okay,
We hear you. We see you. Go ahead.
I thought that all of the comments were great. I really enjoyed listening to them. And something that Jacob said really resonated in me. First of all, whenever I see in Tanach the cutting of the hair, it always reminds me or makes me think of a greater cutting, like a separation, whether in this case it's Israel from God or God from Israel. There's definitely some sort of cutting or breaking. Maybe not God in God's totality, but at least temporarily or partially. We know that with all the predictions of destruction, that a saving remnant does survive.
Yes.
So that raises a lot of questions, like why is God saying this as if he's totally going to destroy the people? And then there's that piece that I always find interesting that God is talking about destroying all the people because they're evil. Are there not 5 people or 10 people or 30 people in the city that are not evil?
Mm,
Of course there are. There must be.
mhm.
But it goes back to that, or it makes me think of that Heschel quote that few are guilty, but all are responsible. So that's all. That's where my thoughts went on this.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful set of insights and reflections. Um, yes, as certainly the question of the severity of the destruction, um, and the idea that so many people will be punished when it's hard to imagine that everybody sinned, and even if they did, that it would be the kind that would deserve this type of reaction is, this is not the first time, won't be the last time, and we don't have necessarily many satisfying answers to this. Lance, I'm going to come back to you in a moment just to say a last thought, just cognizant that maybe it was for the better that we spent most of our time on the hair and didn't dwell too much on the terrible, terrible, second half of the chapter. I would just note probably two little things from the second half of the chapter, which are emblematic of Ezekiel's approach to talking about the sins of Israel. One is the idea of Israel being even worse than the other nations, right? We see that in verse 5 and 6. God says, I put Jerusalem amongst the nations with countries all around her. The implication sort of seems to be she's supposed to stand out, right? You're amidst the nations to be a model, or we don't even have to say that, just to say you're in the context of a family of nations, and so I view you alongside them. And what happened? Verse 6, she rebelled against my rules, acted more wickedly than the nations and countries around her. Now, again, what does that mean? They didn't have the same laws and customs or rules that the Israelites did. So does it just mean they kept their own rules better than we kept? Or like just overall our behavior? We were morally depraved. And even if God didn't expect all the same 613 things of the other nations, but they were not as immoral, or they were more moral than the Israelites. And that seems to be a basis for God's reaction in verse 7, right? Yan hamanchemin hagoyim asher sivotechem. Since you were worse than the nations around you. You didn't even follow their rules. Uchamishpatei hagoyim asher sivotechem lo asitem. Right here, we do have that sense. Ezekiel seems to acknowledge essentially that, Israelites are bound by, or there's some common set of, guidelines and practices for all peoples, and then the Israelites have their own special rules and guidelines in their relationship with God. Not only did we spurn God's laws for us, we didn't even keep the basic national, accepted conventions of behavior of peoples. And so, right, this is essential to the chapter. So, everyone's going to see what your punishment is, right? We've sort of talked about sometimes that idea that they're going to be a laughing stock amongst the nations. That just adds insult to injury. But here we get a little bit more, whether we validate it or not, of God's reasoning. God's reasoning is because in the presence of all the nations, you acted worse than all the nations. So they're going to look and say, look at these people. You brought that upon yourself. I set it up because I placed you amongst the nations. I didn't put you off to the side, but that was, because you were supposed to follow their rules and yours, and you didn't either. They did better than you did. And then we kind of more turn inwards in verse 11, and we talk about the defiling of the sanctuary. And we have these terms that are going to appear a lot: shikutzayich and toavotayich, your detestable things and your abominations, generally code for idolatry, but could also mean sexual or morally depraved behaviors. You brought that into my holy place. So we sort of have the location of the sin is sort of both the Israelites sinned vis-a-vis in the context of the nations around them. That's kind of one environment that we're looking at. They didn't even keep the laws of the people around them, so they're sinners vis-a-vis their external context. And then they also sin vis-a-vis their internal context. The heart of the Jewish people, the heart of Judah and Jerusalem is the temple. And yet you bring that terrible stuff from the outside into the temple. And therefore, in verse 11, we see, Gamani egra velo tachos einai. I won't show pity, and I will also, exactly what egra means is not clear, but it's translated here as shear away. So we have some more of the language of kind of that's the cutting, that's the hair cutting or, cutting off language in verse 11. And then we have the punishment that sort of follows Ezekiel's hair cutting. We see it in verse 12, the different thirds that are going to be punished. Further discussion about that over the subsequent verses, and the various punishments, largely are mentioned here. So that's what I have to say about the chapter. We'll do Mom and Dad, it looks like, and then Lance, and then we'll wrap up. We're spilling over into later time, but always good to get a chance to hear from everybody. So Mom and Dad, and then Lance.
I'm looking at Psalm 125,
Okay.
which I think you mentioned a number of people have added to the Psalms that they say since October 7th. And it has in there, the mountains are round about Jerusalem, and the Lord is round about his people, henceforth and forever. So I picture Jerusalem and the Jewish people in the center of this circle, and God is directly round about them,
Yes.
protecting them. And the nations are outside, further outside the circle. But if the Jews, the Israelites, are not observing God's commands, then God moves further out. And then the nations are closest to the children of Israel. And you can imagine what will happen then.
Right. Yeah, very, very nice reading. And that same term of saviv is consistent in both of them. The surrounding reminds me of the, at the Reed Sea, the pillar of cloud or fire that was leading the Israelites that night before the sea was split, when the Egyptians were approaching them. The Torah says it went from in front of them, which is where it was usually positioned to lead them, and it went behind them in order to then serve as a barrier between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And here it's all, you're sort of pointing out almost the reverse. God is in that protective intermediary position in the usual array of Jerusalem, Israel, Israelites, and then other nations. God sort of serves as a protective wall. And here God is kind of, moving out to the outskirts. So yeah, very good. Lance, last word.
Okay, 2 points. One, what's going on in this chapter of Ezekiel for me is the result of a sadistic sociopath. And two, you might be surprised about this, but I think instead of using a human being, the rabbis and the Kohanim are together in using, number one, a scapegoat, and number two, tashlich.
Say that one more time, Graham. I didn't take Graham. Sorry, Lance. I didn't take it all in.
Okay, the Kohanim use a goat, a scapegoat, and the rabbis on Rosh Hashanah, right, use tashlich, casting your bread on the water, the sins on the water, right? There's Micah also says, let me see if I can get the quote here. Thou will cast all their sins in the depths of the sea. That's Micah 7:19.
Yes.
So those are my 2 points.
Yeah. So what's the parallel here that you're seeing, Graham? That's the question. I keep saying Graham. I'm sorry, Lance. It's because I'm pasting Graham's poem into a file, so we'll have it for next week. Lance, what the question now on the table?
Okay,
what's
so
the parallel to this text, the casting.
Right here, Ezekiel is the suffering servant. In other words, God is torturing Ezekiel, from my point of view anyway. I mean, you could look at it different ways, but I think it's excruciating for any human being to actually, I think it's supposed to be metaphorical perhaps, but this is torture. And rather than getting rid of our sins with use as Stella said, using a human being, I think it's much better to come up with workarounds, if you will, that do the same thing without using a
Got
human
it.
being.
Got it. Got it. So you're commenting on kind of the evolution of Jewish approaches to, atonement of collective sin without bearing it onto one person. So we have the idea of the scapegoat that takes the sins of Israel and is cast out into the wilderness, and then even more kind of, minimally harmful. We have the practice of tashlich, where we, again, however we understand it symbolically, that's a way of casting away our sins without someone else having to bear them. Got it. Got it. Yeah. Yes. Another fascinating notion to sort of think about how we think about where sin goes, and what role we can have in kind of casting it off. Really, really interesting.
Don't they throw things in the sea?
Yes, there's the notion of right, and Tashlich itself. What's fascinating, actually, maybe going a little bit in the other direction about Tashlich, is Tashlich quotes the verse from, I think it's from Micah, "V'tashlich bimtsulot yam kol chatotam." God, you will cast into the depths of the sea all of their wrongdoing. Ironically, we bring back a little bit of an embodied notion of that, or a physical notion of that, when we have the bread custom of throwing bread into the water, right? Actually, Micah's even more abstract. He just says God's going to cast away the sins. It doesn't go on anyone. God will enable them all to just go away. But we're sort of like, no, they've got to be in something. They have to be embodied, incorporated or physical in some way. So we got to have at least bread, to symbolize them. So you might get to some point where you say, I'm not even convinced. It's too theoretical. How do I know my sins really were cast away? I need something to show for it. So sort of there's almost like a swinging pendulum around that question. All right, we went on. What's that? Ezekiel? Good question. I don't know. I don't think it's a typical curriculum, although this past Sunday at the Chidon Tanach, I did hear that the high school curriculum for Chidon Tanach will include some or all of Ezekiel. So it definitely is, part of some body of Tanach which is studied, but I don't know how much it figures into school curriculum. Yeah, it's a rough ride. It's a rough ride. But we're on it together. So thanks to everybody. Love to mom and dad, and see you next week. Bye all. Bye bye.
Thank you.